The sound of rain against steel was a kind of music Marcus Kane had come to understand. It had rhythm, slow, deliberate, and oddly familiar, like the heartbeat of a man who had long ago stopped expecting much from the world but never stopped showing up for it. The Michigan dawn was gray and heavy, the sky smeared with the color of old bruises. Along the industrial park, steam rose from puddles, and the distant hum of a highway filled the silence. Marcus's pickup truck coughed to life, a tired metallic growl that echoed across the empty lot. The Ford was a relic. Paint flaking, door creaking, one mirror held together with tape and hope. It had outlived his marriage, outlasted 2 dogs, and seen more winters than most men could bear. The heater had died 3 years ago, the radio even earlier, but it still moved when he asked it to, and that, in Marcus's eyes, was enough. He drove the 5 miles to the construction site with one hand on the wheel, the other wrapped around a gas station coffee cup that steamed weakly in the cold. His breath fogged the windshield, and for a moment he thought about the photograph taped to his dashboard. A boy in a red flannel shirt, holding a fishing rod, his smile bright as sunlight. The tape was yellowed now, curling at the edges. Marcus reached out and smoothed it gently with his thumb before turning into the gravel lot. The site was already alive when he arrived. Cranes groaning, engines growling, men shouting over the wind. Steel beams rose from the earth like the bones of some giant creature trying to claw its way out of the mud. A sign by the gate read Miller Construction, Warehouse Project Phase 2, but most of the letters had been rubbed off by rain and time. Marcus parked his truck at the far edge of the lot, where nobody else ever did. He stepped out, the cold biting at his cheeks, and reached for his welding bag. A heavy, scuffed leather satchel that looked like it had been through a war. "Morning, old man," someone called from across the lot. Marcus looked up. 3 younger workers stood near the tool shed, all grinning. One of them, a tall, wiry kid named Brett, pointed at the truck and laughed. "Didn't know they still made those in one piece." Another added, "Hell, I bet he's got to weld it back together every night just to get home." Marcus didn't reply. He just adjusted the strap on his shoulder and kept walking, boots crunching through gravel and frost. The laughter trailed behind him, but it didn't stick. He'd learned long ago that some things weren't worth answering. Inside the welding tent, the air smelled of burnt metal and oil. Sparks danced in the dim light, flickering like fireflies. Marcus put on his gloves, heavy and worn at the fingertips, and lowered his mask. When he lit the torch, a blue flame hissed to life, bright, alive, and steady. There was comfort in that sound, in the heat that kissed his face and the orange glow that filled the edges of his world. He didn't need words here. The metal spoke for itself, through the way it melted, fused, resisted. By 8 o'clock, the noise of machinery filled the air like a constant storm. Marcus barely noticed. He moved with a rhythm built from years of repetition. Measure, align, spark, fuse. Every movement had purpose. Every breath was timed to the hiss of the flame. It was only when a shadow fell across him that he looked up. "Hey!" a voice said, young, confident, slightly unsure of its own authority. "You Marcus Kane?" Marcus lifted his mask. The man standing in front of him was in his late 20s, clean-shaven, wearing a neon safety vest too bright for this kind of work. His boots were new, spotless, still stiff. His hard hat had no scratches, which told Marcus everything he needed to know. "Yeah," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's me." The man extended a hand. "Tom Miller, site engineer." Marcus shook it, his grip firm but unhurried. "You Miller as in Miller Construction?" Tom smiled. "My father's company, yeah. I'm helping out." Marcus nodded. He'd seen this story before. The boss's son, learning the ropes, trying to prove himself to the men who had dirt under their nails. Tom glanced at Marcus's setup, the tools, the welding rig, the perfectly aligned steel plates. "You've been here since Phase 1, right?" "Since before that," Marcus said. "I was on the prep crew. Dug the first trench myself." Tom nodded, looking impressed. "Then I guess you know this place better than anyone." Marcus just shrugged. "Better than some. Not better than time." Tom blinked, unsure how to reply. Well, I'll be checking the joint integrity this week. You mind if I watch for a bit? Marcus tilted his head, a faint smile under the soot. Suit yourself. For the next hour, Tom stood a few feet away, notebook in hand, while Marcus worked. The young engineer watched how Marcus moved, how he balanced the torch, how his wrist flicked just enough to keep the weld smooth, how his eyes never seemed to leave the glowing seam even when the light grew too bright. It wasn't the kind of skill you learned from a manual. It was muscle memory, patience, trust. At one point, Marcus stopped and turned to him. You ever weld before? Tom shook his head. Not really. I studied the thermodynamics behind it, though. The way heat transfer affects the metal grain. Marcus chuckled softly. That's nice. But metal don't care about theory. You treat it right, it holds. You rush it, it cracks. Just like people. Tom wrote something down in his notebook, though he wasn't sure what it meant. By lunch, the sky had cleared. Workers sat in groups under the scaffolding, trading jokes, sandwiches, and the kind of talk that filled the space between exhaustion and routine. Marcus sat alone by the edge of the lot, eating from a small metal lunchbox. A thermos beside him hissed softly as steam escaped. Brett walked by again, chewing loudly on a burger. Hey, old man, that your lunchbox or a museum piece? Marcus didn't look up. Depends. You hungry enough to find out? The men laughed. Brett hesitated, then walked off, muttering. Tom, watching from a distance, noticed the exchange. He thought Marcus was quiet because he was timid. But now he saw something else, restraint. A quiet kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. When the lunch bell ended, Marcus stood, dusted off his knees, and went back to work. The afternoon light stretched long across the steel skeleton of the warehouse. Each beam caught the sun like a blade, the reflections flashing against the workers' helmets. Marcus climbed up onto a scaffold, 40 feet above ground, and began welding a cross joint. The wind was stronger up here, and every movement had to be measured, deliberate. Tom called up from below. You sure that joint's stable enough to start welding? Marcus didn't look down. Stable enough for me to stand on it. That's not a regulation answer. Marcus's voice came through the sparks. Neither's gravity, but it still wins every time. Tom couldn't help but grin. The rest of the day passed in a haze of sound and fire. When the whistle finally blew at 5, Marcus packed his tools, lowered himself down, and sat on the edge of his truck's tailgate. His hands ached. His back felt like rebar. But when he looked at the half-built structure, the lines of steel rising into the fading sky, he felt something close to peace. He knew this place, the rhythm of creation and exhaustion, the beauty hidden in repetition. He started the truck. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. The radio flickered briefly to life before going silent again. As he drove out of the lot, the sun dipped below the cranes, turning the sky the color of rust. The road home was long and empty. His trailer sat on the outskirts of town, beside a half-frozen lake. It wasn't much, one room, one bed, one chair. A rusted stove in the corner. A coffee maker that groaned like it wanted to die. But it was his. He kicked off his boots, sat by the small window, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Outside, the world was quiet. Just the whisper of wind across the lake. He picked up the photo again. The boy's name was Ethan. 10 years old now, if Marcus had kept count right. His ex-wife had stopped answering calls 2 years ago. The number probably changed. Maybe the boy didn't even remember his father anymore. Marcus sipped his coffee and stared at the photo until the light faded. When he finally turned off the lamp and lay down, his body sank into the mattress like a man falling through time. He dreamed of steel and fire and the sound of a child's laughter echoing through an empty workshop. The next morning came early. Frost clung to the windows, and the truck groaned in protest as he started it. He made it to the site before anyone else, as always. He liked it that way, the quiet before the noise. When the others arrived, they found the coffee machine already warm and the welding tent clean. Marcus never said he'd done it, but everyone knew. Tom came by later, holding a clipboard. Morning. You're here early. Always am, Marcus said. I wanted to talk to you about the weld seams on beam 7B. They're not aligning with the design tolerance. Marcus nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. Show me. Together they walked along the half-built frame, the cold wind whipping through the gaps. Tom pointed at a joint near the corner. It's about 3 millimeters off spec. Marcus crouched, studying it. Yeah, because the base plate's warped. You fix the top, you'll stress the whole beam. Tom frowned. But the plan. The plan wasn't written in the rain, Marcus interrupted, tapping the steel with his wrench. Reality's got different math. Tom opened his mouth, then closed it again. He took notes quietly. When he looked up, Marcus was already walking away, the torch slung over his shoulder like a weapon from another age. That night, Tom stayed late, trying to reconcile the blueprints with the real-world measurements. He couldn't. The numbers didn't line up. Eventually, he went to the welding tent, where Marcus was still working, sparks lighting his face like tiny stars. How do you know it'll hold? Tom asked suddenly. Marcus didn't stop. Because I've seen what happens when it doesn't. The young engineer didn't ask more. He didn't need to. For the first time, he began to suspect that Marcus Kane, the man everyone laughed at for being poor, might know more about holding things together than anyone else on the site. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping softly on the roof of the tent. That night, long after everyone had gone home, Marcus stayed a while. He walked the length of the unfinished structure, running his hand along the cold steel. The building was growing, day by day, each beam holding its own weight, and yet he could feel something fragile in it. A tension, a slight tremor under his palm. He frowned. Something wasn't right. He made a note on a scrap of paper, tucked it into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd check the load distribution on the main column, just to be safe. Then he turned off the torch, stepped into the dark, and drove his truck home through the rain. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would be the day the world came crashing down. And when it did, Marcus Kane would be the only thing standing between life and death, holding up the weight of everything he'd ever been. The morning broke sharp and colorless, like the edge of a blade pressed against glass. Wind swept across the site, carrying the scent of metal dust and rain-soaked earth. The steel frames of the warehouse shimmered faintly in the pale sun, skeletal and magnificent, a cathedral of labor rising from mud and sweat. Tom Miller stood at the perimeter fence, coffee steaming in his gloved hands, watching as the crew trickled in. He was still getting used to mornings like this, the rough cadence of voices, the clang of tools, the unspoken hierarchy that thrived in every worksite. These men didn't care about degrees or titles. They respected whoever could keep the roof from falling on their heads. He had grown up in an office world, climate-controlled, coffee machines, spreadsheets. Here, everything was louder, heavier, and dangerously alive. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Marcus Kane, the man he couldn't quite figure out. Tom had spent half the night replaying their conversation from the day before. Marcus's words, "Reality's got different math," had gnawed at him. His father had built the company on precision, on blueprints so exact they were practically scripture. But this welder, with his rusted truck and steady hands, seemed to see truth in places no laser could measure. When Marcus arrived, early as always, Tom called out, "Morning." Marcus lifted a hand in a casual wave, coffee thermos tucked under his arm. His clothes looked the same as yesterday. Faded jacket, jeans stained with grease, the kind of outfit that never changed no matter the weather or the paycheck. Tom walked over. "I've been reviewing the 7B welds. You were right about the plate warping. I adjusted the model." Marcus took a sip from his thermos. "Good. Might keep the roof where it belongs." Tom chuckled. "You always that optimistic?" "Optimism's just hope without homework. I prefer math." Tom smiled despite himself. "You sound like my dad." Marcus's expression softened, a rare flicker of warmth behind his gray eyes. "Then maybe your dad knew what it costs to keep a thing standing." Tom nodded. "He did. He worked his way up from a framing crew before he started the company. I think that's why he sent me here. Said I needed to learn what steel feels like before I tell other people how to use it. Marcus set his thermos down, squinting at the rising sun. Smart man. Shame most sons forget that kind of lesson. The wind caught Tom's clipboard, rattling the papers. He gripped them tighter, unsure if Marcus was teasing him or just stating a truth he wasn't ready to face. Come on, Marcus said, motioning toward the scaffolding. You can help me check the main column alignment. I think something's breathing wrong. Breathing wrong, Tom repeated, amused. Marcus shrugged. Metal breathes, expands, shifts, contracts. You ignore it, and one day it decides it's had enough of being ignored. They climbed up the scaffold, boots clanging against steel. The sun glared off the beams, 1,000 tiny mirrors stabbing at their eyes. Marcus moved like he'd done it 1,000 times. Easy, balanced, confident. Tom, though athletic, felt clumsy by comparison. Halfway up, Marcus paused. He ran a calloused hand over the main column, listening more than looking. Hear that? Tom frowned. I don't hear anything. Exactly, Marcus murmured. You should. He tapped the beam gently with his wrench. The sound was flat, a dull note instead of a ring. Marcus frowned. There's tension building where there shouldn't be. Probably from that new crossbeam they added yesterday. Tom leaned closer, checking the bolts. Everything looks tight. That's the problem, Marcus said. Too tight in the wrong spot. Metal needs space to live. Tom jotted a note in his pad. I'll flag it for inspection. Flag it all you want, Marcus muttered. But if they don't loosen the bracket before the storm tonight, she's gonna sing, and not the pretty kind. The young engineer raised a brow. Storm? Marcus looked toward the horizon, where thick clouds were already gathering like bruises. Always one coming sooner or later. By mid-morning, the sight was a roar of motion. Sparks flew. Engines rumbled. Radios blasted country music no one really listened to. Marcus worked in the shadow of the giant frame, his torch cutting arcs of blue fire against the gray day. Tom moved between crews, measuring, inspecting, checking load tables. He tried to keep his thoughts technical, but they kept drifting back to Marcus, the way the man seemed to feel the structure. There was no arrogance in him, no pretense, but a kind of quiet authority that didn't need to speak loud to be heard. Around noon, Tom found himself near the brake tent, watching Marcus eat alone again. The others sat in clusters, trading crude jokes, talking about football, laughing too loud. Marcus had a half sandwich and a thermos of soup. His hands looked like they'd been carved from the same metal he welded, scarred, steady, unyielding. Tom hesitated, then sat across from him. You mind? Marcus looked up, chewing slowly. You're the boss's son. You can sit wherever you want. Tom smiled faintly. That's not how it works. Sure it is, Marcus said. Just depends on what kind of boss you want to be. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the plastic walls of the tent. Finally, Tom asked, You got family, Marcus? Marcus didn't look up. Once. You don't talk to them? Not much to say. Tom nodded, sensing the boundary. I get that. My dad and I barely talk unless it's about work. My mom says we speak the same language, we just use it to argue. That got a small chuckle out of Marcus. That's family. You fight 'cause you care. Or you stop fighting 'cause you gave up. Tom studied the older man, curious. Which one are you? Marcus took a long sip of soup, eyes distant. Guess I stopped fighting. The air grew heavy after that. The kind of silence that carried its own weight. At 2 o'clock, the wind howled harder. Clouds thickened, pressing low over the cranes. The foreman barked orders to secure loose materials, but most of the crew kept working. Deadlines were deadlines, and nobody wanted to fall behind schedule. Marcus climbed back up the scaffolding, torch in hand. He was checking the top joint when he felt it. A subtle vibration under his boots. Not much, just a shiver through the steel. But to a man like Marcus, it was enough. Tom! He called down. Get up here. Tom looked up from his clipboard, startled. What's wrong? Feels like she's shifting. Tom climbed quickly, his heart pounding from both exertion and unease. When he reached the platform, Marcus pointed to the column's base. The weld there looked fine at first glance, but there was something unnatural about the angle, a hairline bend invisible to untrained eyes. Tom crouched beside it, tracing the metal. "Could be thermal stress," he said. "The temperature dropped fast when that wind came in." Marcus shook his head. "No, this ain't temperature. It's pressure. Something below's not anchored right." Tom frowned, glancing at the blueprints on his tablet. "The specs show reinforcement on the west footing." "Specs don't hold steel," Marcus muttered. "Bolts do." The wind gusted again, harder this time. The entire scaffold shuddered. Marcus steadied himself. "Tell the crew to stop. We need to check that base." Tom hesitated. "If we stop now, we'll lose half a day." "The foreman'll." Marcus turned to him sharply, eyes cold and clear. "You think the structure gives a damn about your schedule?" The words hit harder than Tom expected. He nodded and climbed down, shouting for the foreman. But by the time the message got through the chain of command, the rain had already started, fat drops that hissed against the steel, turning everything slick and dangerous. Marcus stayed where he was, gripping the beam, watching the clouds roll in. He'd seen storms like this before, the kind that didn't ask permission, didn't wait for anyone to be ready. When the first crack of thunder rolled across the sky, he muttered under his breath, "She's gonna move." And she did. A deep groan echoed through the skeleton of the building, the kind of sound that made the hairs on your arms stand up. The column trembled. A rivet popped loose and skittered across the scaffold, hitting Marcus's boot. He shouted down, "Clear the area, now!" Panic spread like lightning. Workers scrambled, voices overlapping, tools clattering. Tom ran back toward the main frame, shouting orders. Marcus dropped to one knee, inspecting the column joint. The welds were fine, too fine. They'd been sealed without proper flexibility, making them brittle under sudden strain. Someone had rushed the job. The ground trembled again. The sound of metal shifting became a chorus, low, grinding, alive. "Tom!" Marcus yelled. "Evacuate the north wing. That's where she's leaning." Tom waved his arms, shouting to the crew. "North wing. Move it." The rain turned to a downpour. Lightning split the sky. The warehouse skeleton swayed, subtle but deadly. Marcus moved fast, checking each anchor point as he went. The bolts at the base were wet. One of them barely tightened. His heart sank. He grabbed a wrench, tightening it with every ounce of strength he had. Then came a sound he'd never forget. A high, keening screech, metal shearing against metal. The column cracked, just enough to shift the entire load above it. "Marcus!" Tom shouted from the ground. "Get down!" Marcus looked up. The beam overhead was bowing, sagging toward him. He jumped sideways, hitting the platform hard as a section of steel snapped free and crashed into the mud below. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The rain, the shouting, the wind, then chaos. The west side scaffold gave way first, collapsing in a roar of twisting metal. Workers screamed, running for cover. Tom felt the ground shake beneath him as debris rained down. Marcus dragged himself to his feet, lungs burning. He saw the column buckling at the center, the heart of the structure. If it fell, it would take half the frame with it. He grabbed his radio. "All clear?" "Static." He looked around. 3 men were trapped near the base, one pinned under a steel bar. Marcus didn't think. He moved, sliding down the scaffold, boots slipping on wet rungs. He hit the ground running. The rain blinded him, but he found them. One conscious, one shouting, one silent. He heaved the bar up with his shoulder, straining. "Move!" he yelled. The man crawled free, blood on his hands. Marcus threw the bar aside. Tom appeared through the haze. Mud splattered up to his knees. "Marcus, you have to get out." Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. The column's failing." Tom's eyes widened. "We can fix it later. Come on." "There won't be a later if it goes down." Marcus shouted over the storm. "Get the rest out." Tom hesitated, torn between command and fear. Then he ran, rallying the others while Marcus turned back to the structure. He reached the main column and saw the fracture. A long, jagged split creeping up like a vein. He could almost feel the pain of the steel. The whole frame was groaning, desperate. He wrapped his arms around the base, pressing his shoulder into it, pushing with everything he had. The weight pressed back, merciless. "Hold together," he whispered. "Come on. Just a little longer." The world narrowed to sound. The storm, the steel, the beating of his heart. Every muscle screamed. His gloves tore. His boots sank into the mud. But the column held. At least for now. By the time Tom returned, drenched and shaking, most of the crew had cleared the site. Only Marcus remained, still braced against the column, chest heaving, face streaked with grime. "Marcus!" Tom shouted, stumbling toward him. "You have to let go. It's over." Marcus looked back, eyes blazing through the rain. "Not yet." The column shuddered again, a terrible, living thing. Marcus gritted his teeth and pushed harder. The beam above him groaned but didn't fall. Tom took a step closer, then stopped. For a moment, through the chaos, he saw something ancient in the man's stance. Not defiance, but purpose. And that image burned into his mind. Marcus Kane, the man they'd mocked for being poor, standing beneath a collapsing world, holding it with his bare hands. Hours later, when the storm finally passed and the site was quiet again, the damage was done, but not total. Half the structure remained. 3 men lived who shouldn't have. Marcus's gloves lay in the mud, torn and blackened. His thermos rolled nearby, dented but unbroken. Tom stood beside the wreckage, staring into the silence. He didn't know whether to pray or curse or cry. He just knew he'd never see the world the same way again. The rain didn't stop that night. It lingered long after the sirens faded, long after the last floodlight was turned off, long after the bodies were carried away. It was the kind of rain that softened everything. The dirt, the metal, the memory of what had just happened, until all that remained was silence. Tom Miller stood under the half-collapsed canopy. His hard hat still on, though the strap was loose and useless now. The warehouse skeleton loomed before him, twisted and broken, an iron carcass against the sky. The air smelled of ozone, rust, and something faintly electric, the scent that followed lightning strikes and loss. He had given his statement twice already, once to the police, once to the company investigator. Both times, his words had come out like someone else's. There was a structural failure. Heavy rainfall compromised the west footing. Worker attempted stabilization. Words that sounded clean, sterile, almost harmless. He didn't mention Marcus's voice shouting over the storm, or the way the man had braced himself under the weight of the column like a saint holding back the wrath of God. He couldn't. The words didn't fit inside the report form. When they found Marcus's body, he was still in that same position. One knee in the mud, arms stretched against the steel, as if even in death he was unwilling to let go. The rescue team had to cut through the beam to lift him free. The coroner said it was instant. Tom knew better. Nothing about that man had ever been instant. Now, as the rain whispered across the site, Tom stayed where he was. He couldn't make himself leave. The floodlights cast long, trembling shadows across the wreckage. And somewhere deep in the mud, Marcus's glove still stuck out like a forgotten relic. At some point, the foreman approached him, umbrella tilted awkwardly. "You should go home, son. There's nothing more to do tonight." Tom nodded but didn't move. The foreman sighed. "It's a damn shame. He was one of the good ones. Quiet but good. Didn't deserve that." Tom finally spoke, his voice low. "He saved 3 men. The foreman hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I know. The others are still in shock." "Hell, so am I." The man walked away, leaving Tom alone again. He stayed until the rain turned to mist, until the floodlights dimmed and the only sound left was the distant drip of water against metal. When he finally walked to his truck, his clothes clung to him like another layer of guilt. The drive home was a blur of headlights and reflection. The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically, hypnotic. He replayed everything. The crack, the scream of steel, Marcus's face beneath the beam. There was something unshakable in that image. It wasn't just bravery. It was peace. As if Marcus had finally found the one thing he was born to do, even if it cost him everything. When Tom reached his apartment, the clock read 3:17 a.m. He didn't bother undressing. He sat on the couch, soaked, staring at nothing. Outside, the rain kept falling, softer now, like the earth itself was mourning. He didn't sleep. Morning arrived gray and hollow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thin veil of fog over the city. News trucks had already gathered by the site, broadcasting tragedy in their usual cadence. Measured, tragic, and detached. A welder, identified as Marcus Kane, was killed in yesterday's structural collapse at a construction site in northern Michigan. Sources say his actions saved several co-workers. Tom turned off the TV. The sound made him sick. He drove to the office instead of home. The building was quiet, most of the staff still reeling from the event. When he walked in, a few heads turned, whispers followed him down the hall. The boss's son, the one who was there, the one who survived. His father was waiting in the conference room, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired. "You all right, Tom?" Tom nodded. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I said I'm fine." His father studied him for a moment, then leaned back. "They're calling it an act of God. No one's blaming the crew. The inspectors will handle the rest." Tom clenched his jaw. "It wasn't an act of God." "What are you saying?" "It was preventable," Tom said quietly. "The base plate was installed wrong. It was rushed." His father sighed. "Even if that's true, it won't bring him back." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" Tom hesitated, searching for the words. "He tried to warn us." Marcus knew something was wrong. The older man rubbed his temples. "Tom, you can't carry every accident on your back. It's not an accident if someone saw it coming." His father's gaze hardened. "You're not responsible for that man's choices." Tom stood, voice trembling. "You didn't see him. You didn't see what he did." He left before his father could answer. That evening, Tom drove north, past the highway, past the last exit, until he found himself on a narrow road that ran beside a frozen lake. He didn't know why he kept driving until he saw it. A small trailer at the edge of the woods, the door slightly open, a faint smell of smoke and oil lingering in the air. Marcus's home. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The place was neat, almost painfully so. Tools hung in perfect rows along the wall. A cot by the window was made with military precision. There was a stack of books on the table, welding standards, the craftsman's spirit, the old man, and the sea. But what caught his eye was a single photograph on the shelf. A boy, maybe 8, holding a fishing rod, grinning at the camera. The same photo Marcus kept in his truck. Beside it lay an envelope, unsealed. The handwriting was careful, uneven, like someone who hadn't written in a long time. Tom unfolded it slowly. "Dear Ethan, I don't know if this letter will reach you. Your mom probably told you I wasn't much of a father. Maybe she's right. But I want you to know something. Everything I've ever built, I built because I thought someday you'd see it and know I was still trying. If you ever walk past a building and feel the ground solid under your feet, maybe I had a hand in it. That's enough for me. You don't have to remember my face, son. Just stand tall. Hold things together. Love, Dad." Tom stared at the letter until the words blurred. Outside, the lake was frozen, the surface reflecting the dim gray of dusk. He stepped out, the cold biting his skin, the letter trembling in his hands. Somewhere far away, a train horn sounded, long, mournful, fading into silence. He thought about his own father, about the distance that had grown between them over years of ambition and expectation. He thought about Marcus, who had lived quietly, died loudly, and left behind only steel and memory. Something broke inside him then. Not a sob, not a collapse, but a quiet surrender. The following week passed in fragments. Meetings, calls, statements. The investigation confirmed structural error but cleared the workers of negligence. The news moved on. The world kept spinning. But Tom didn't. He spent his days helping with cleanup, working alongside the same men who had once joked about Marcus's old truck. No one laughed anymore. One afternoon, as they removed debris near the north section, a worker called out, "Hey, Miller, look at this." Tom walked over. Buried in the mud was Marcus's lighter, a small brass piece engraved with scratches and initials. He picked it up, thumb brushing the surface. The hinge was bent, but when he flipped it open, a tiny spark still flared to life. He stared at the flame until the wind blew it out. That night he couldn't sleep again. He sat by his desk, the lighter in his hand, the letter folded neatly beside it. On his computer screen glowed an empty document. The cursor blinked, waiting. He began to type. For Marcus Kane, the man who taught me what strength looks like. Words poured out of him. Not reports, not technical notes, but something real. He wrote about the day of the collapse, about the way Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, about how courage doesn't shout but holds steady. He wrote until dawn. When he finished, he printed it, folded the pages, and placed them inside Marcus's lunchbox, which had been returned by the crew. Then he drove back to the site. The air was cold and clean, the ground still damp from melted snow. The new framework was already going up, stronger, safer, supervised twice over. At the edge of the lot stood a small memorial, a steel beam upright in the dirt, Marcus's name engraved into it. Tom knelt beside it, placing the lunchbox at its base. The sunlight caught the engraving, and for a moment, it seemed to glow. He whispered, "You held it, Marcus. You held all of us." A breeze swept across the site, carrying the faint sound of metal humming. Not groaning this time, but singing. Days turned into weeks. The warehouse rose again, each beam welded with care, each bolt double-checked. Tom was different now, quieter, more deliberate. The men listened when he spoke, not because of his title, but because they saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He visited Marcus's grave once a week. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he just sat and said nothing. The silence felt like a conversation between two men who finally understood each other. One afternoon, his father joined him there. The older man stood beside him, hands in pockets, eyes on the headstone. "I read your report," he said softly. "You wrote about him." Tom nodded. "It was good," his father continued. "Honest. You've grown a lot." Tom smiled faintly. "He taught me." His father looked at him, the lines on his face deepening. "You know, I started this company welding in a garage. I used to think success was about building bigger, faster, stronger. Maybe I forgot what it means to build right." They stood in silence for a while, the wind rustling through the grass. Then his father said, "We're naming the warehouse after him. The Kane Distribution Center. Feels right." Tom's chest tightened. "He'd hate that." "Probably," his father said with a small laugh. "But we'll do it anyway." They both smiled. That night, Tom returned to the site one last time before the final inspection. The lights of the new structure shimmered against the dark, clean, symmetrical, perfect. He walked through the aisles, his footsteps echoing. In the center stood the main column, rebuilt and gleaming. He reached out, placing a hand on the steel. It was cold but solid, alive in its own way. He closed his eyes and listened. For a moment, he could almost hear it. The whisper of rain, the echo of a voice saying, "Hold things together." He smiled. "Still trying, old man." Outside, the first drops of a new storm began to fall. The new warehouse opened under a blue sky that felt almost too clean, too bright, as if nature itself had decided to scrub away the memory of storm and loss. Reporters gathered at the front gates, cameras glinting under the sunlight. The sign above the entrance gleamed in fresh chrome letters. The Kane Distribution Center. Tom Miller stood behind the crowd, just far enough to see everything yet not be seen. His father was at the podium, speaking about resilience, teamwork, progress. All the right words, shaped perfectly for public consumption. The applause came on cue. People clapped for the story they wanted to believe. The noble worker, the heroic sacrifice, the company that learned and grew stronger. Tom's jaw tightened. He should have been proud. Proud that the building stood. Proud that the project was complete. Proud that the name Kane would be remembered. But something about it all felt too polished, too quick to move on. The truth didn't fit in sound bites. The truth still lived in the cracks of the steel, in the rain-soaked mud where Marcus had fallen. When the speeches ended, Tom slipped away. He walked around the side of the building, tracing his hand along the cool metal wall. The scent of paint and concrete still hung heavy in the air. The structure was flawless, every beam exact, every weld perfect. Yet perfection, he realized, came with its own silence. It lacked the heartbeat that Marcus had given it. He stood there until the noise faded behind him. Then he lit the old brass lighter, Marcus's lighter, and watched the tiny flame flicker against the wind. Still holding things together, he murmured. One way or another. 2 months later, Tom was assigned to a new project, a manufacturing complex on the outskirts of Detroit. It was his first time leading a full crew. The company had grown cautious after the accident, double-checking every safety protocol, every inspection. Tom didn't mind. If anything, he insisted on it. The crew respected him, not for his name but because he worked harder than anyone else. He was the first on site, the last to leave. He learned to weld, to measure, to climb scaffolds with the same ease Marcus once had. He didn't just manage. He labored beside them. It felt right, as if this was how he could keep Marcus alive. Through sweat, through calloused hands, through the unspoken dignity of work. Still, at night, the memories returned. The groan of metal, the smell of wet rust, Marcus's voice shouting above the storm. Sometimes Tom woke gasping, his palms burning with the phantom ache of steel cutting into flesh. In those moments, he'd light the brass lighter, hold it in the dark, and imagine the flame was the heartbeat of someone still watching over him. The Detroit project was bigger than anything he'd worked on. 5 structures, 6 crews, 70 men. His father wanted it done in 8 months, a near impossibility, but the company needed the win. Investors were watching. Competitors were circling. Tom knew the numbers, but numbers didn't feel like the truth anymore. He'd seen what happened when you treated people like deadlines. So he moved differently. He checked every plan twice, every beam personally. He learned every name on site. One morning, a rookie welder dropped a beam latch during hoisting. A near miss that could have crushed a man. The foreman chewed him out until Tom intervened. "Easy," he said quietly. "We don't need fear here. We need focus." The welder, a kid barely 20, looked up with shaking hands. I just slipped, sir. Won't happen again." Tom crouched beside him, voice steady. "It's not about never again. It's about paying attention. Steel doesn't forgive. You give it respect, it gives you another day." The kid nodded, eyes wide, as if he were hearing the words of someone who'd been in the fire before. Later, when Tom walked away, one of the older workers muttered, "Sounds just like Marcus." Tom stopped, half smiling, half haunted. "Yeah," he whispered. "He taught me well." By the 3rd month, the structure began to rise. A forest of steel and ambition. Tom spent his lunches up high, sitting on a beam, sandwich in one hand, wind in his face. From up there, the city looked smaller, quieter, almost kind. It was the only place he felt close to peace. One day, while sitting there, he noticed something below. A section of scaffolding anchored at a strange angle. His eyes narrowed. He climbed down to inspect it. The bolts were fine, but one of the lower supports was misaligned, off by an inch. It wasn't dangerous yet, but left alone, it would strain under load. He called the foreman over. "Who set this section?" "Crew 4, the man said. "They're solid." "Maybe," Tom replied, "but this alignment's wrong. Fix it before shift change." The foreman frowned. "That'll take half a day. We're already behind." Tom's voice sharpened. "Then we fall behind. Fix it." The foreman hesitated, then nodded. No one argued with Tom Miller anymore. That night, rain came again. Not heavy, but enough to wash the dust into the cracks of concrete. Tom stood at the edge of the site, the city lights distant and blurred. The sound of rain on metal filled the air, that same whisper he remembered from the night Marcus died. He tilted his head, listening. It almost sounded like breathing. "You're still here, aren't you?" he said softly. "I'm still listening." Weeks passed. The project moved faster than expected. Every safety check passed, every crew report clean. The boardroom loved him. His father called one night to say, "You're finally finding your stride, son." Marcus would have been proud. Tom smiled faintly. He already was. But deep down, pride wasn't what he felt. It was vigilance. A constant, gnawing need to keep things right. Every bolt, every weld, every man. Because the moment you relaxed, the world reminded you how fragile it all was. He carried that tension everywhere, even home. His apartment filled with sketches, blueprints, diagrams. He'd wake in the middle of the night to adjust a load calculation or rewrite a safety checklist. Sleep was optional. Precision was not. Some nights, he'd drive back to the site at 2 a.m., climb up to the half-built structure and walk the beams in silence. The city below shimmered, unaware of the ghost walking above it. He'd stop at the top, light Marcus's lighter, and let the wind dance around the tiny flame. "You kept it together," he'd whisper. "I'll do the same." But one evening, as autumn crept into the air, something shifted. He was reviewing a new shipment of beams when he noticed inconsistencies in the weld seams, hairline fractures barely visible to the naked eye. They weren't catastrophic, not yet, but they were dangerous if ignored. He called the supplier. "These don't match the specs." The man on the other end stammered. "Sir, we passed inspection." Tom's voice was flat. "You passed paperwork. I'm talking about reality." After hanging up, he brought the issue to management. The project supervisor shrugged. "Replacing the beams will set us back a month. Just reinforce the joints and move on. The margin's fine." Tom stared at him. "The margin's what killed Marcus Kane." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I get it. You were there. But this isn't that. Don't let ghosts run the job." Tom leaned forward, voice low. "Ghosts don't kill people. Shortcuts do." He walked out before the man could answer. That night, Tom stayed behind long after the crews went home. He inspected every suspect beam himself, flashlight in hand. His knuckles brushed across the cold steel, and he thought of Marcus's words. "Metal breathes. You ignore it, it'll remind you it's alive." He could feel it now, that subtle, restless pulse beneath the surface. He tightened a bolt, rechecked the seam, marked a few pieces for replacement. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The next day, rain again. The kind of slow, steady rain that seemed to haunt every turning point in his life. The site was slick, the wind biting. Crews worked cautiously, boots sliding in the mud. Tom climbed up to inspect the new crossbeam placement. Halfway up, a worker shouted, "Hey boss, you might want to look at the southeast joint. It's off alignment." Tom descended quickly. The moment he reached it, he saw the issue. The wrong bolts. Smaller diameter, cheaper grade. Not failure grade yet, but far below spec. His stomach turned. "Who approved this?" The foreman paled. "We followed the sheet from management." Tom exhaled. A long, trembling breath. He turned toward the office trailer. Inside, he found the supervisor sipping coffee, feet up, oblivious. Tom slammed the bolt onto his desk. "This isn't spec." The man blinked. "They're within tolerance." "Not for this load." "Who signed off on this batch?" The supervisor's tone grew defensive. "Procurement cleared it." "What's your problem?" "My problem," Tom said, voice shaking now, "is that I'm not burying another man because you wanted to save a few dollars." The room went silent. Rain hammered the windows. Finally, the supervisor muttered, "We'll review it." Tom left before the argument could continue. Outside, he tilted his face to the rain, letting it wash the heat from his skin. His heart was pounding, not from anger, but fear. the kind of fear that came from knowing how easily history could repeat itself. That night, alone in his truck, Tom took out Marcus's lighter again. He turned it over in his hand, thumb brushing the engraved initials. He whispered, "You'd laugh if you saw me now. Same rain, same fight." He lit it, holding the flame steady. But not the same ending. Not this time. The next morning, he filed a formal halt order. It delayed the entire project by 3 weeks. Upper management hated it. His father called him personally furious. "Tom, do you know what this costs us?" "I know what it saves," Tom said quietly. His father was silent for a long moment. Then softly, "You've changed." "Yeah," Tom replied. "He changed me." When the inspection team arrived, they found exactly what Tom had suspected: material fraud in the supply chain. Dozens of bolts were under strength. The halt prevented what could have been another collapse. The news spread through the crews like wildfire. Some cursed the delay, others thanked him quietly. Either way, no one questioned his call. The warehouse eventually finished late but flawless. And Tom didn't care about the delay. For the first time since Marcus's death, he slept through the night. Months later, on the anniversary of the first collapse, Tom returned to the Kane distribution center. The memorial beam still stood by the gate, its surface catching the golden light of sunset. He knelt beside it, setting a new brass lighter at its base. Polished and used, engraved with fresh letters. "To Marcus Kane, who taught me to hold things together." Then he stood, looking up at the sky. The air smelled like rain again. Somewhere, a storm was forming, miles away. He smiled. "Guess it's your kind of day." As the first drops began to fall, he walked back toward his truck. The world around him shimmered. Steel, water, memory. All merging into one endless reflection of what it meant to build and rebuild. He drove away, headlights cutting through the mist, the sound of rain whispering against the windshield like a familiar voice saying, "Keep going." Winter came quietly that year, slipping into Michigan like a ghost too polite to knock. The mornings grew sharp with frost, the lake glazed with glassy ice, and every sound seemed to travel farther in the thin air. Tom Miller felt the season before he saw it. In his bones, in the stillness that followed the storm of work, in the sudden absence of noise. For months his life had been measured by the clang of metal and the hum of machines. Now there was only the hum of his refrigerator and the steady ticking of the wall clock that seemed to echo in the empty apartment. He should have felt relief. The Detroit project had closed perfectly, no accidents, no missed inspections, no cracks in the numbers or the steel. The company had called it a model execution. His father had shaken his hand in front of the board and said he'd never been prouder. Investors smiled, employees cheered. Yet when the applause ended, Tom felt only the hollow weight of silence pressing against his ribs. Success, he realized, sounded quieter than he'd imagined. Most nights he came home late, his boots leaving a trail of salt and dirt on the floor. He'd toss his jacket over the chair, heat a can of soup, and sit in the dark watching the steam twist up from the bowl. He no longer kept the television on. The voices felt foreign, like another language from a life he no longer belonged to. The only thing he kept close was Marcus's old thermos. Dented, stained, still faintly smelling of coffee and metal. He filled it each morning out of habit, though he rarely drank from it. It had become less a container and more a ritual, a way of carrying something solid through the day. He told himself the exhaustion would fade, that leadership always carried its own kind of solitude. But as weeks slipped into months, the solitude turned heavier. The men still respected him, but they spoke to him differently, carefully, as if he were something fragile. The board trusted him implicitly, yet he trusted no one. Every small error, every overlooked detail, made his pulse quicken. He began staying at the office past midnight, combing through reports for invisible flaws. One night his father found him there. The older man leaned against the doorway, tie loosened, eyes tired. "You're still here?" Tom didn't look up from the screen. "Just finishing the safety audit." You finished it yesterday. I'm double-checking. His father sighed, stepping closer. You can't live like this forever. You've done good work, Tom. You've earned rest. Tom's laugh was dry. Tell that to Marcus. The words hung in the air. His father flinched slightly, as if struck by something unseen. You think he'd want this? You think he'd want you to drown in guilt for what happened? Tom shut the laptop slowly. It's not guilt. It's memory. There's a difference. Memory shouldn't chain you, his father said. Maybe, Tom murmured. But sometimes that's the only way to keep from forgetting what matters. His father didn't answer. He simply placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, heavy, brief, almost awkward, then left without another word. After he was gone, Tom sat in the dim light, the computer screen reflecting in his eyes like a window he couldn't close. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and soundless. He watched the flakes drift down past the glass, each one vanishing as it touched the city's heat. For a moment, he imagined Marcus walking through that snowfall. A shape of gray and steel, hands in his pockets, face turned upward. Then the vision was gone, leaving only the whisper of the HVAC and the hum of his thoughts. When the new year came, the company celebrated with banners and champagne. Tom attended out of obligation. The banquet hall glittered with suits and sequins, laughter bouncing off marble walls. His father gave another speech about resilience and integrity, about the human spirit behind every beam of progress. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Tom smiled for the photos, shook hands, accepted congratulations. But somewhere between the speeches and the toasts, he slipped out to the terrace. The night air hit him cold and clean. Down below, the river shimmered under the city lights like liquid steel. He pulled Marcus's lighter from his pocket, the old one, not the new one left at the memorial, and flicked it open. The flame rose weakly, trembling in the wind. He held it there until it burned his thumb. The pain grounded him. Behind him, a voice said, "I was wondering where you disappeared to." He turned. It was Sarah, one of the project coordinators from Detroit, someone he hadn't spoken to properly in months. She wore a black coat over her dress, her breath visible in the cold. "Needed some air," he said. "I figured." She leaned on the railing beside him. "You hate these things, don't you?" "I don't hate them," he said. "I just don't know what they're celebrating anymore." She studied him for a moment. "You've changed." He smiled faintly. "So they tell me." "No, I mean really changed. You used to talk about blueprints like they were puzzles. Now you talk about them like they're graves." The words hit harder than she intended. He looked away. "Maybe because one of them is." She hesitated, then said softly, "You can't keep carrying that alone, Tom." He closed the lighter, pocketed it. "If I don't, who will?" There was nothing she could say to that. She just nodded, and after a moment she left him there with the river and the flame that refused to go out. February came with more projects, more deadlines, more noise. The company expanded into new territories. Tom was offered a promotion, vice president of operations, the kind of position that would have thrilled him years ago. He declined. Instead, he proposed something else. A safety program in Marcus Kane's name. He called it the Hold Initiative, a series of workshops teaching young workers not just technical precision but the philosophy behind it: patience, respect, responsibility. His father hesitated at first. The board called it unprofitable sentiment. But Tom insisted, and for the first time, the older Miller didn't argue. "Fine," he said. "You run it. Make it mean something." So he did. The first class met in an unused corner of the Detroit warehouse. 10 trainees, 1 whiteboard, a stack of steel bars, and Marcus's old helmet sitting on the table like a relic. Tom taught them how to read the metal's mood, how to listen for the faint hum that told you a joint was right. But he also told them stories about mistakes, about silence, about the cost of arrogance. He never mentioned Marcus by name until the final day. Then he placed the helmet on the floor and said, "This belonged to the man who saved my life." He didn't have a degree or a title, but he understood what most of us forget, that holding something steady sometimes matters more than finishing it fast. So when you're up there one day, and the wind's howling, and everything in you says to run, remember him. The room was quiet when he finished. One of the trainees, a girl barely 20, asked, "What was his name?" Tom smiled. "Marcus Kane." He held the beam. They all nodded, solemn, as if hearing a legend. When they left, Tom stayed behind, sitting on the floor beside the helmet. The late sun slanted through the windows, painting the steel gold. He whispered, "They'll remember, Marcus. Promise." For the first time in months, the silence felt like peace. Spring thawed the city. The lake cracked and shimmered, the streets filled with the scent of wet earth. Tom began taking walks again. Mornings along the pier, evenings through old neighborhoods. Sometimes he'd see welders on scaffolds, sparks flying like fireflies, and he'd stop to watch. The rhythm soothed him. The world was still building, still breathing. One Sunday he drove north, back to the small trailer by the woods. He hadn't been there since the night he found the letter. The door creaked when he pushed it open, dust motes spinning in the sunlight. Everything was as he remembered, the tools, the books, the fishing photo. But now it felt different, lighter somehow. He sat at the table, tracing the grain of the wood. "You'd laugh if you saw me running classes," he said quietly. "I sound like you now. Maybe that's the point." He took a folded envelope from his pocket and set it beside the old letter to Ethan. His own handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Dear Ethan, you don't know me, but your father saved my life. I thought you should know what kind of man he was, quiet, stubborn, endlessly patient. The kind of man who could hold up the world for others and never ask to be noticed. He taught me what it means to build something that lasts. I hope someday you'll come see the place named after him. It stands strong because of him. And so do I." He left the letter on the table, weighed down by the lighter so it wouldn't drift. Then he stepped outside and stood by the lake. The wind rippled across the water, carrying the scent of thawing pine. Somewhere behind the clouds, the sun broke through, scattering light across the surface until it looked like molten steel. He closed his eyes and breathed. For the first time, he didn't hear the echo of collapse, only the whisper of rain turning to calm. Time moved again. The company thrived, the hold initiative spread to other sites. Workers carried patches with Marcus's initials stitched over their hearts. Tom traveled constantly, teaching, inspecting, listening. The work became his prayer, his way of keeping faith with the dead. Yet even as the world rebuilt itself around him, part of him remained at that beam under that storm. Sometimes, during long flights or hotel nights, he'd dream of it, the moment the steel bent, the weight of air before the fall. But the dream changed slowly. Each time, he saw Marcus not trapped beneath the beam but standing beyond it, nodding once before walking away into the rain. Each time, Tom woke with tears he didn't quite understand. One morning in late May, his father called. "We've got another warehouse coming up near Grand Rapids," he said. "They want you to oversee it personally. Big job." Tom hesitated. "I'll do it, but I want to bring some of the trainees." "Fine," his father said, then paused. "Tom, I'm proud of what you've made of this, of yourself." Tom smiled. "You should thank Marcus for that." "I do. Every day." They hung up without more words. But for once, silence between them felt whole rather than hollow. The Grand Rapids site reminded Tom of the first warehouse. Same open field, same skeletal frames rising toward a gray sky. Yet this time he wasn't haunted. He felt prepared, steady. When storms rolled in, he didn't flinch. He checked every bolt, every brace, until the wind itself seemed to nod approval. One evening, as he stood atop the scaffold watching lightning dance far off in the hills, he felt something close to gratitude. Not for the loss, never that, but for the strange mercy hidden inside it, the way one man's death had taught him how to live. Below him, the crew called out good nights, laughter echoing through the rain. The city lights shimmered in puddles like scattered stars. Tom stayed a little longer, watching the storm drift closer but not afraid. He reached for the lighter in his pocket, flicked it open, and held the flame high against the wind. It burned bright, unwavering. "For you," he whispered, still holding, and for a moment, the thunder sounded less like anger and more like applause. The letter arrived in late autumn, wrapped in a plain white envelope and postmarked from Michigan. It carried no return address, only a single name typed in small, careful letters: Thomas Miller. Ethan Kane turned it over in his hands, curiosity tugging at the edges of long-forgotten ache. He was 30 now, an architect working in Portland, divorced, restless, still chasing structures that never felt steady enough to stand inside. The name on the envelope meant nothing to him, not at first. But when he opened it, the first line stopped his breath. "Dear Ethan, you don't know me, but your father saved my life." He read the letter 3 times, slowly, until each word began to feel heavier than the last. It spoke of a man he barely remembered, a welder who had died on a rainy Thursday in Michigan, holding up a collapsing building so others could escape. It spoke of courage not as glory, but as quiet endurance. And it ended with an invitation. If you ever wish to see what he built, what he held together, come to the Kane Distribution Center in Detroit. I'll be waiting. The handwriting at the bottom was careful, fading, steady. For hours Ethan sat in silence, staring out the window at the gray city streets, the rain streaking down glass. He hadn't thought of his father in years, not really. His mother had spoken little about him, and when she did, it was always tinged with resentment. He chose work over family, she'd said once, voice trembling. He chose metal over you. But now, holding that letter, Ethan wondered if she'd been wrong, or maybe just hurt. Maybe his father hadn't chosen steel instead of him. Maybe he'd chosen to make the world safer for him. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket, and by the next morning, he was on a flight to Michigan. Detroit greeted him with cold sunlight and the smell of rain-soaked concrete. The cab ride from the airport took him through stretches of industrial parks and warehouses, steel skeletons that seemed to rise endlessly from the earth. When the driver stopped in front of one in particular, Ethan felt something stir in his chest. The sign read, Kane Distribution Center. He stepped out slowly, the wind tugging at his coat. The building stood silent and strong, broad steel beams gleaming against a pale sky. It was beautiful in a way that caught him off guard. Not polished, but honest, like the lines on an old man's hands. Inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic. Workers moved through wide corridors, their footsteps echoing. Near the center of the floor stood a single steel beam upright, encased in glass. On it, engraved in small, clean letters, was his father's name. Marcus Kane, 1977 to 2023, he held the beam. Ethan's throat tightened. He reached out, resting his fingertips on the glass. It was warm under the lights, almost pulsing. "You must be Ethan." He turned. An older man approached, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and kind eyes. His gait was slow but sure, his hands rough from years of work. "I'm Tom Miller," the man said softly. "Your father's friend." Ethan hesitated. "You wrote the letter." Tom nodded. "I wasn't sure it would find you." "It did," Ethan said. "And I had to see this place." Tom smiled faintly. "Then come. There's more to see than walls." He led Ethan through the vast structure. The echo of footsteps, the distant clang of forklifts, the rhythm of machines. It wasn't just a warehouse. It felt like a living heart, beating quietly under its own weight. "Your father built the first version of this place," Tom said. "It collapsed during a storm. He held the main column long enough for the others to get out." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "And you were one of them." "Yes," Tom said. "He saved my life. And he changed it." They stopped at a small room overlooking the floor. An office filled with blueprints, photos, and tools arranged neatly on the wall. On the desk sat an old welding helmet, blackened and cracked. Beside it lay a brass lighter and a faded photograph of a boy holding a fishing rod. Ethan reached out, fingers trembling. "That's me," he murmured. Tom nodded. He kept that photo in his truck. Said it reminded him why he built. Ethan's vision blurred. "I don't remember him much, just flashes. His hands, the smell of smoke. I thought he left because he didn't care." Tom's voice was gentle. "He never stopped caring. He just didn't know how to be both, a builder and a father. Some men hold the world steady, Ethan. They forget to hold themselves. For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, the faint hum of machinery filled the silence. Then Ethan said, "You kept all of this for him." Tom smiled. "He kept it for all of us. I just made sure it stayed standing." He opened a drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed with age. "Your father started writing this before the accident. I found it in his trailer." Ethan unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was uneven, familiar in a way that hurt. "Ethan, I'm sorry I missed your last birthday. I know you think I forgot, but I didn't. I just didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound small. The truth is, everything I build hoping it'll last longer than I do. Maybe that's the only way I know how to love. If you ever wonder who I was, look at the things that still stand." Ethan pressed the paper to his chest, eyes burning. Tom rested a hand on his shoulder. "He wasn't perfect, son, but he was true." They stood like that for a while. Two men, one carrying the weight of memory, the other passing it on. Later that evening, Tom took him to the lake, the same lake where Marcus had lived, though the trailer was long gone. The water reflected the dying light, rippling gold and gray. Tom set down a thermos and poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Your father used to sit here every morning before work," Tom said. Said the lake reminded him of metal. Strong, calm, reflective. Ethan sipped the coffee. It was bitter, but grounding. "You sound like you knew him better than anyone." Tom smiled wistfully. "Maybe, but even then, I don't think anyone truly knew Marcus. He belonged more to the work than to the world." The wind picked up, scattering ripples across the lake. Ethan stared out at the horizon. "You built this place, the Kane Center, the training programs. Why?" Tom looked at the water for a long moment before answering. "Because when someone holds up the world for you, you don't walk away. You build something to keep it from falling again." Ethan nodded slowly. "I design buildings, but I've never built something that meant anything." Tom turned to him, eyes steady. "Then maybe it's time you start." The next morning, Ethan returned to the Kane Center alone. The workers greeted him politely, not knowing who he was. He spent hours walking through the corridors, running his hands along the walls, tracing the weld seams with quiet reverence. Every joint, every bolt seemed to whisper something. Not words, but presence. At the far corner of the facility, he found a small workshop. The door creaked open to reveal shelves of tools and a welding bench still faintly smelling of smoke. On the wall hung a quote carved into a piece of metal. "Courage is what you do when no one's watching." He smiled through his tears. "You really were everywhere, weren't you?" He sat down at the bench and lit the lighter, the same one Tom had kept all these years. The flame flickered, steady and alive. He placed it beside a piece of raw steel and whispered, "I don't know if I can build what you built, but I'll try." The next weeks passed quietly. Ethan stayed in Detroit longer than he'd planned, helping Tom teach new trainees. He learned to weld, to listen to the metal's breathing, to feel the hum of strength inside the silence. The work was hard, humbling, sacred in a way he hadn't known existed. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk through the warehouse alone, listening to the echoes of distant hammers. He imagined his father's footsteps among them, slow, sure, eternal. And little by little, the ache inside him softened. Months later, the first Hold Initiative building completed under Ethan's supervision opened its doors. A small training hall in Flint. He named it the Kane Workshop. Inside, at the entrance, he placed a plaque that read, "For Marcus Kane, who taught us to hold things together." On the day of the opening, Tom stood beside him, older now, his hair silver white under the morning light. "He'd be proud," Tom said. Ethan smiled, eyes shining. "So would you." Tom shook his head. "I'm just passing the torch." Ethan reached into his pocket and took out the brass lighter. "Then take this. You kept it burning long enough." Tom hesitated, then smiled and closed Ethan's hand around it instead. "No, son. It's your turn." They stood there for a while, watching the new trainees arrive, young men and women with clean gloves and nervous eyes. The sound of welding torches began to fill the air, the same song of fire and steel that had shaped both their lives. Tom looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting slowly overhead. "Funny thing about fire," he said. "You can't keep it. You can only pass it on." Ethan nodded. "Then I'll pass it on, right?" The two men shook hands, and in that grip lived 1,000 unspoken things. Gratitude, forgiveness, inheritance. A year later, when Tom passed away quietly in his sleep, Ethan returned to the lake once more. He brought two things with him, the old thermos and the brass lighter. He sat by the water until dusk, the sky painted in bruised colors. Then he lit the lighter one last time and held it up against the wind. "Thank you," he whispered to Tom, to his father, to the men who had taught him that strength wasn't about holding forever, but about holding long enough. When the flame finally flickered out, he smiled. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, the same as the day his father had fallen. The same whisper, the same promise. He rose, turned toward the lights of the Kane Center glowing in the distance, and began to walk. Each step steady, each breath sure. The torch had changed hands, but the fire, the quiet, steady flame would never die.